A good question we had that came in was about the idea of secondary infallibility. And a viewer asked exactly what is meant by that term, the secondary infallibility of the church. And they asked if things like the church's universal discipline and canonizations and canon law fall under this category of secondary infallibility.
Yes, they can. Yeah. I mean, the church has been given the charism of infallibility. We refer to that as the ordinary magisterial authority of the church, or teaching authority. The Roman pontiff has that as an extraordinary magisterial authority. We refer to the Roman pontiff himself speaking ex cathedra as being the extraordinary magisterium. But the day-to-day teaching of the church, which keeps the church on the right track, exactly faithful to the teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ, teaching of faith and morals. These are areas where the church has her primary infallibility in matters of faith and morals. But there are other areas which the church necessarily speaks on that are not the object of her, matter of faith and morals, but they still enjoy an infallibility, a charism of infallibility, and we call it secondary infallibility, because they are so closely connected with matters of faith and morals. And one of those is canon law. The church has a universal law governing the church herself. As a perfect society instituted by Jesus Christ, the church has laws which govern her, and what we call canon law. One might ask, well, is the canon law of the church also protected by the gift of infallibility? And the church would say the canon law is the secondary object of the church's infallibility. It's secondary only because it's not directly a matter of faith and morals, but it certainly touches on faith and morals. There's no question about it. So if one were to ask the question, can the church publish something and enjoin by law on her members something that is actually gravely immoral, that is against the moral law of God? Can the church decree something in her canon law which is contrary to the faith, such that it would contradict the faith? And the answer is no, the church cannot do that, because her law, her universal law, is protected by the charism of infallibility as a secondary object of her infallibility. To prevent the church from teaching true faith and true morals, her primary object of infallibility, but then contradicting it in her law. An example of that, perhaps touching home today, would be in the 1983-84 Code of Canon Law of John Paul II. It is approved under certain circumstances to give Holy Communion to non-Catholics. And there are rules that are spelled out there. They're rather meaningless because the church has always condemned this and said, no, under no circumstances could you do that. So when the new Code of Canon Law under John Paul II says you can and lists the circumstances, that is completely contrary to what the church has always taught. Even on the battlefield, for example, when the church has said, if you come across, let's say, a Russian Orthodox or a Greek Orthodox soldier who's fallen and is dying, the church said you could conditionally anoint the person, but you could even conditionally absolve him. If there's any possibility he isn't actually of goodwill and just really unknowing. He's validly baptized, but he just doesn't know. But you could never, even then, give him Holy Communion. Because the very idea of Holy Communion means you are one in faith. You are in the communion of faith with him, and he doesn't have that faith, a communion of faith with you. So the idea that you can give what we know as Holy Communion, to give Holy Communion to someone who does not have the Catholic faith, manifestly, avowedly does not have the Catholic faith, would be contrary to all practice of the Catholic Church, going back to even apostolic tradition. So there you have a case of the new Code of Canon Law coming out after Vatican II under John Paul II, which actually contradicts the teaching and the practice of the Church for all of the centuries prior to it. And that is one argument that people use to say, well, therefore we know that this new code of canon law cannot have the authority of the church behind it, because if it did, it would be protected as the church's secondary object of infallibility, and it could never have taught that. Actually sanctioning something, approving something that is contrary to the faith and immoral and sinful to do.
And Father, it seems another effect that new code of canon law would be that it would cause some people to call into question the idea of this secondary infallibility in regards to canon law, because I know there are some, our writer referenced this, there are some who try and come up with different arguments of why this particular code of canon law, the idea of secondary infallibility, doesn't apply to it. This writer says that he's heard some argue that this is not a universal discipline because it doesn't apply to perhaps the Eastern rites. It only applies to the Roman rites. Therefore, it's not universal, and therefore it's not infallible. So that seems to be another effect that it kind of just calls this whole thing into question.
It is grasping for straws. Yeah.
Seems like it.
It is what it is. I mean, it's the code of canon law of the church. And it's true, the Eastern churches, the Eastern Catholic churches have their own particular law. That's true. But to say that they are not affected by or have nothing to do in relationship to the code of canon law regarding the Roman church, the Roman, that's not true. That's just trying to find a way out of a dilemma. Yeah. And there is no way out of this dilemma except to admit that there's a problem with the new code of canon law of John Paul II. There's a problem with that. And that is, it contradicts the church's consistent practice and teaching with regard to this matter. I mean, all of this talk about giving communion to Lutherans and Orthodox and Brother Roger of Taizé, the Taizé community, which Benedict XVI himself did. I think it was at the funeral of John Paul II. Right? The man's not a Catholic. Publicly giving him Holy Communion is contrary to the Church's law. But they say that let's see, among the conditions that the new code of canon law lays down is, first of all, they have to believe what Catholics believe about the real presence of the Blessed Sacrament. Okay, that's a good start, right? Who does that, right? Maybe the Orthodox, but outside of that, no. And but then they must not be able to go to their own church to receive. So they cannot have the possibility of receiving in their own church, so they can come to the Catholic Church to receive, as long as they have the Catholic belief about the Eucharist. Now, as far as their belief about living in adultery or anything like that, that doesn't even register at all. It's nowhere to be seen here. Or even other things that are, gravely immoral. I mean, confession, absolution from mortal sin, fasting, it just doesn't apply, see. So this is just gravely wrong. And people cannot find a way around this. They have to face the question. Okay, well, if the canon law of the church is covered and protected by this as the secondary object of the church's infallibility, because it impinges directly on faith and morals, and you have a code of canon law, such as that of 1983-84, that contradicts the church's faith and morals and practice. How does one explain that? Except to say, not that, well, then canon law is outside, the secondary object doesn't apply. No. The way to look at it is to say, well, there's something wrong with the canon law, and the authority that imposed it is questionable. That's the least you could say about that.
And I think everything you said applies exactly the same to canonizations as well, right?
Apply to canonizations too. It can, certainly. Yeah. I mean, when the church canonizes someone, the church says this person had a heroic sanctity. And the church looked to miracles. It was 4 miracles, then down to 2, then down to 1, and I think in some cases they just dispense with them entirely now. So they've kind of done away with the idea of sanctity as the church has always understood it. Now sanctity is being just a good scout. There's more to be said about that, but it doesn't need to be said. All this talk about giving Holy Communion on Catholics, Of course, that's what Francis is known for, just telling non-Catholics, oh, just go ahead and receive. Just go ahead and receive. You know, you make up your mind whether it's right for you. And it really goes back to John Paul II's Code of Canon Law and introducing that possibility, which is certainly not a Catholic possibility. The Church should never recognize that. Even St. Justin Martyr, in the middle of the 2nd century, in the year 150 or so, wrote about this matter of the Holy Eucharist and the Catholic teaching of the Holy Eucharist. And he says explicitly that we will not give this body and blood of Christ to anyone unless they are one in faith with us, unless they have our faith. He says it there. That was the constant practice of the Catholic Church, and still is.